Welcome to the New Monastics Podcast, where we'll be discussing all aspects of the contemplative life and interspirituality in the context of modernity. On each episode, we will choose a topic to explore with one of today's leading teachers or thinkers. The New Monastics Podcast is a project of Charis Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality, which is dedicated to the emergence of a newly conceived contemplative life of embodied spirituality and sacred activism. Welcome to the New Monastics Podcast. I'm Nathaniel, co-founder of Charis Foundation and dialogue partner for our guests.
And I'm Daniel, the host for the show.
Today we have my friend and colleague, Dr. Edward W. Bastian, the founder of the Spiritual Paths Institute and author of Interspiritual Meditation, as well as Mandala, creating an authentic spiritual path.
Welcome, Ed. We're so happy to have you on this show.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Nathaniel, would you like to lead us in?
Well, Ed, we've known each other such a long time, and it's interesting to come into a conversation like this and start it as if fresh, for all the people that don't know what we know between us. So I think maybe it's a good start to talk about how we know one another. I can say that, back I think as far as 2002, we were introduced by my teacher, Rabbi Zalman Schechter Shalomi, and I believe you'd come to him seeking his imprimatur for your new venture in spiritual paths, and he recommended me as a person to work with you and do editing and different things for your website. And I'm so grateful for that opportunity so many years ago. But I'm wondering if maybe you can tell us how your own interspiritual project began. What are the origins of you coming into becoming now, one of the leaders in defining and describing what interspirituality is today?
Gee whiz, how far back do I go? The subtle influences, the explicit influences, the implicit influences. I think that I grew up in Iowa in a Presbyterian sort of religious cultural milieu. And I remember I really thought being a minister would be great, but then when I heard him talk about predestination, I thought, no, that's that idea that God knows what you're going to do before you do it. And it's just like, no worries, he's in charge. And that's just like, well, I'm in charge of my destiny. At least I had the illusion that I was. So that set me off, sort of began my searching for options. And then I think, after college, I didn't do much. I mean, you guys are at Europa, so that's what you do there. But I was at the University of Iowa playing basketball, and that's not what you do there. And in fact, jumping ahead 10 years, I was back at the University of Wisconsin, where I had played basketball against the Wisconsin Badgers, and I was living in the basement of a Tibetan monk studying Tibetan Buddhism. So how did that happen? And but in the meantime, I had done films with film project with the Dalai Lama in 1970, and had just been exploring around. And when I met the Dalai Lama, I thought, okay, I really want to know what he knows, because he is speaking to being both spiritual, ethical, and a political leader, which is what I didn't see because I was working in presidential politics in America in 68. And I was meeting the people leading our government. I was 24, and I was very disillusioned. So that set me off on a process of exploration. And how can I become the kind of person that I want to become, not if I just keep down this track of politics just to be like them. But it kept leading me deeper and deeper. His Holiness the Dalai Lama suggested that I go to Wisconsin and work with Geshe Sopa. And so then I was off on a totally different track, doing things that I never had shown any aptitude for, which was like learning languages, learning Sanskrit, learning Tibetan. I think I flunked Latin once, and just no aptitude at all. But what I discovered was that if I had the why, why do I want this? Then the how would come. Then I could train the brain, to actually do grammar, to do syntax, to create a new language. So Buddhism was like that, because you're learning a whole new way of life. And so this interest in the combination, working in India as a Fulbright scholar and working with Hindu teachers and so forth, just piqued my curiosity. And then as I began to think about what my contribution would be, I was working at the Smithsonian, and I began thinking, what is it that the new generations are going to need that aren't part of a tradition? How can they create a spiritual path and find meaning and purpose in their life and a sense of who they are essentially and what connects them in a grander scale? But if they have to do it on their own, how are they going to do that? And so I became, kind of not obsessed, but I became dedicated to that kind of notion of the importance of developing new materials and a new approach to help people, whether they call themselves from a tradition or not, to create their path. And, the audacity to say, I'm making my own religion. And so, yeah, when I was back in Colorado, moved back there where I'd helped start a school in 1970, and our school was learning style based. Before learning styles became a word, we called it child-centered, but we thought our job was to teach the kids the way in which they are predisposed to learn according to their styles. And it was a collaborative process among the teachers. And so I really was attracted to that. And I began to realize, this is now moving back and forth in time, but back in 1970, I began to realize why I was not getting A's in school. I didn't know why, but I wasn't. And I realized my learning style was not appropriate to the way in which it was being taught. So the best I could do was a B, And so I began to resonate with that and thinking, wow, why doesn't religion do that? They say in the olden days that a guru when a chela would come and say, I want to learn this and that, the first question the guru would say is, how do you learn? How do you know? And then to be able to teach them appropriately. So there are the 4 yogas in Hinduism, come into play. And so to me, what was making sense was, how do I combine this interest in all the different religions, my experience in, which we could talk about with Thomas Keating, but adding the dimension of learning styles, spiritual styles, to help people find their way based on who they are and how they learn. And so that became my passion in terms of this interspiritual work that we're doing.
It's interesting that there's a way in which the religions as they exist in different forms and different sects already seem to represent learning styles. If you're coming into the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism or Zen Buddhism or Islam, there are already styles present that will work better for one person than another. And then it sometimes becomes a challenge if a person grows up in a culture and the religion that is dominating that culture has a learning style that doesn't fit that person. They don't really have choices. And to find yourself within a tradition can be difficult. So I just find it interesting that the religions themselves represent some styles, and then we see people that don't fit them so well or have to adapt themselves or have to choose minority paths within them. Have you ever noticed this?
Yeah, and I wouldn't say it's the religion per se, because there's so many varieties within every religion. So it's really the learning style or the spiritual style of the person who's teaching you, because they may be drawing on, commentaries and teachings of their tradition, which resonate with them. If they're very intellectual, they're going down the Jesuit path. If they're very devotional, they're going down a devotional path and so forth. So it's the teacher, and trying, to me, then, knowing your learning style, or your predominant ones, the dominant and recessive ones, can help guide you in choosing the teacher that's right for you. Because, I think we find that everybody at some point in their life, I don't know everybody, most people, I think, they get a yearning to find answers to their deepest questions and to have some certainty, to have some spiritual presence within them. And when they're ready for it, it could be a tragedy in their life, somebody getting sick, they're facing their cancer diagnosis, whatever it happens to be. Well, they're gonna choose who's available, and it may not be the right person. And then they say, well, I'm really intellectual. That person is devotional. This doesn't work. I'll never be spiritual. Boom, that's it. And the golden opportunity of a crisis in their life, kind of passes. So it's like not just the religion, but it's like Rumi within Islam, right? That's more of a style. And it's more like Milarepa within Tibetan Buddhism. That's kind of a style. And, yeah.
So what worked for you within Tibetan Buddhism? As you were introducing, some of your path, lots of things that I know, you've lived a fascinating life and had the opportunity to meet many extraordinary people and, found yourself in front of the Dalai Lama, working with Lowell Thomas, etc. These are amazing things. And at a certain point, you're working closely with Geshe Sopa, one of the great masters of Tibetan Buddhism to come into America and really influence a number of people who are today the leading scholars and teaching the next generation of scholars. So how is it that you found yourself in that tradition? What worked there in terms of your learning style?
I found what I didn't know, that I didn't really have much trust in my intellectual capacity, because I wasn't raised that way. And I all the way through college, I was more of an athlete type. I never really thought I actually have a mind, although I yearned for it, but I didn't have the confidence that I had it. But what I began to realize when I was talking to the Dalai Lama over a number of sessions back in '70, it was like, he's got good reasons for what he's believing in. And I began to realize that's the missing part for me, is that I need to use my intellect. I need to use my faculty of reason to discern what's right for me. And so then this, within the Tibetan Buddhist, Gelugpa tradition, they're known for that. It's not that the other traditions don't have it, but the Gelugs seem to have a lot of it. And so I just sort of fell into that. And, so the teachings of Buddhism that I encountered had a lot of reason, epistemology and logic. And, I found it fascinating as a kind of a foundation for my belief. And so it became fuller for me that way. And then, of course, I began to discover the other parts of me, too, that needed to be brought to the fore, like my kinesthetic style, my body, bring it into play, my devotion, my prayer, my interest in art and poetry. And all of those then began to fill out my understanding of Buddhism. So it wasn't just one narrow, just kind of one way. So I just began to experience that myself and to say, well, my appreciation and my practice, by accessing all the different ways in which I know, that would be our archetypal styles, residing in the unconscious. The more of those I give voice to and recognize and bring out, the richer my own practice becomes. And so I think the Dalai Lama was, to me, exemplified that. And he does, on one hand, he's fostering the neurosciences on meditation. On the other side, he's doing Tantra, Kalachakra Tantra, and practices where he's now wearing a deity costume and, engaged in a Tantra. So how do those fit with each other? The intellect on one side, but then using the imagination and going deeply, using that part of it. So that to me it's always been fascinating, and it's kind of spurred me on to activate more and more of those tendencies or aspects within me to explore. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, in many ways, and we haven't talked about this so much, but the Dalai Lama himself is an exemplar for you, a model of combining reason and an open approach to modernity, and yet staying rooted in the tradition.
Well, yeah, so why interspiritual? So, it's, right, okay, I got Buddhism.
Exactly.
I was kind of arrogant about my Buddhism. I thought, hell, I got Buddhism. I know about meditation. Oh, you Christians, what do you guys know? Seriously, it's kind of there. You probably notice that in Europa there becomes a sort of ego thing. We're the real thing here. And so at that stage in your life when you're looking for an identity, then you say, claim it. You say, I'm going to be that, and then I'm better than the other ones. And to some extent, I had that. I wouldn't. It wasn't on the surface. But then I met Thomas Keating, and that was in the '80s, and we had the most amazing conversations sitting in his room at St. Benedict's Monastery. He was so curious about Buddhism and my experience meditating and about all these different traditions. And then he did this thing called the Snowmass Conference, where he invited great teachers, meditation exemplars from many different traditions. And I was just longing to be part of that. But they already had a Buddhist. But one year she couldn't come. He said, well, why don't you come this year and be the Buddhist? With a grin on his face. Mm-hmm. So I did. And it was mind-blowing to me because we entered into deep meditations with each other and deep discussions. And I realized that these people, they've got the goods. They've been doing a serious contemplative practice within their tradition. We are sharing with each other a deep resonance. There's something connecting us. It's not the name of the religion. It's not the name of a God. It's not the belief in some metaphysical, thing that is better in their tradition than another. It was the affect, I guess you could say phenomenologically, on all of us gathered in that room. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And this is more of what people are going to need than more Buddhism. How many Buddhists, I'm teaching Buddhism, but how many people are really going to do Buddhism? The need is much grander. And there are a lot of good Buddhist teachers coming along. I don't need to do that. So it was like, oh, there's this new thing emerging. And then Teasdale, Brother Teasdale gave a name to it in turn of the century. And then we're looking for a word. What describes? Because as you know, we were working together then up to now. And we had great teachers teaching with the Spiritual Paths Foundation that I set up in 2002. So it became much more interesting and much more exciting to be working in that. And then that word that Wayne Teasdale came up with was interspiritual. So we said, let's use that word. And so we began using it in 2002. And, we still are. It still seems to be maybe the best word to define the contemplative dimension that exists within the world's great traditions. And that if we can join there, it doesn't matter what we call ourselves. We are joining at the deepest level of our interbeingness. And that's what kind of holds me to this kind of the dream, the vision of interspiritual.
As you're speaking to the Snowmass conferences with Thomas Keating, can you just share a little bit with the listeners? What was the structure of those dialogues and how did they impact you being there? You're speaking to how they led to kind of this understanding of interspirituality more deeply, but I'm curious about maybe some of the experiences you had that were transformative for you and kind of pointed you in this direction of interspirituality.
Well, thank you for the question. I think in the beginning, of course, I was new and I was a little bit, I didn't really know what to expect. But what I found was that Thomas intentionally gathered a group of people that he would invite back year after year so that you got to know each other on a personal level. You got to know about families and illnesses and life struggles and life, good things as well as difficult things. So we were joining as human beings. And then when we entered into the discussion with each other about our respective, contemplative practices, there was that very human dimension to it. And so then we could ask each other questions and say, did you experience this? What was that like? And then we would meditate together, but it was silent, right? So nobody was leading the meditation. And so I began wondering, could it be if we're all doing something structurally that's the same thing, like some sort of liturgy or some kind of a process that we could all share, and then we could have a beginning, middle, and end. The ritual is kind of important, but we didn't do that. So that curiosity led me then from that experience with these wonderful people at Snowmass in the development of our Spiritual Paths Institute, when Net Panel became involved with me, and we began expanding to bringing in this. We had 40 or 50 different teachers coming in, to join our programs, and so then it became an opportunity then to explore what is it we have in common with each other, And what I found was that there was a little bit of resistance to this sort of kind of phrase that, that all God is one with different names, right? Or we all believe in the same thing, but we express it in different ways. But I found that the great teachers with whom I'm working, they would say, well, maybe. How would we know that for sure? But it's a nice idea, but do we need to posit that as the truth when we don't even know that it actually is true? So what is it that we have in common on another level? And so that drove me then to this process level. What do we have in common when it comes to the development of a contemplative process? So that became, for me, the kind of quest. And I would ask them questions, and then we would experiment with meditations we could all do together that weren't exclusively and didn't use anybody's name of their God or their Savior or anything, but we could engage in a meditation that would include silence, but a little bit of guidance as well. But careful not to say, the way into this silence has to be through this doorway, through Allah, through God, through whoever it happens to be. So leave that out of it so that you're not, predisposing or giving the person to whom you're leading the idea that this is the way in. So I try to be very careful, even though Buddhism was a big, important thing for me, not to lead in, by saying, the Buddha said, and I encourage people with whom I'm working and teaching, to try to be as neutral as possible, but not to not mention it, but to mention the metaphysics, the soteriology of the end goal, sort of as part of it, but not the way you got to do it. I'm sorry, I'm running on a little bit here.
No, it's good. And it's this direction I wanted to go in. Because, when a person becomes, a Buddhist today the way you did, yeah, it's very natural that you're convinced and it feels like the way, and it's certainly the way for you. And so it'd be very natural for a person to become very exclusive. But then coming into the Snowmass experience, this experience of the Snowmass dialogues, my sense is that you were always fairly open and you didn't get too exclusive. But there, it's that kind of exclusivity is easily worn away because you're with people of great competence and often great mastery in their traditions. And you'd have to, put blinders on and, put earplugs in to ignore it. And so it wears away the sense of superiority. And then when you can have an experience together of the kind of those roots beneath the surface that are connecting you, as you've often described during the periods of silence, that we were a collective in that meditation experience, that has an impact that leads into the zone that becomes what we talk about today, interspirituality. And there's a question out there, and I'm often talking about this, and you've proposed one answer, is that when we begin respecting each other's paths as important to one another, but maybe not so important to us, and we have these different paths, but we want to meditate together. We want to have community together, because often our best spiritual community sometimes isn't our co-religionists. Sometimes our best spiritual community is like you and I and many of our colleagues. We have, different personal paths, but we share a greater path and we want to meditate together. How are people going to meditate together without bowing to one another's traditions? So as you said, not making one another say Allah, not making one another say Om Mani Padme Hum, because that becomes a very specific door. And so you propose something ingenious, which is a structure for practicing together, which doesn't do harm to a person's individual impetus, but they can find themselves within the structure and go through it. And so maybe you can describe a little bit of what that structure of interspiritual meditation is, because it's not really a prescription, it's an opportunity.
As you were speaking, I was thinking about I didn't mention, but at the Smithsonian, I directed the first programs on biodiversity.
Right.
I knew nothing about ecology. Seriously, I'd hardly ever taken a course, but I was pretty good at organizing. And so I was working with the National Academy, working with E.O. Wilson and these incredible minds, to do this program. And I became more and more sensitized to the importance of diversity in the health of any ecosystem. And that was not a topic that was being studied much in the day. It was more ecology, and before that, systematics, and it was more individual species. And so I began looking at that. Was a big influence on me. So when you begin to look at spiritual traditions and contemplative traditions, I was thinking as you were talking, it's more like an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Right. And within that ecosystem, it requires a certain amount of diversity for its health. Right. And so when we are looking at what happened to religions and whole cultures based on a specific religion and social group and so forth, on a tribe, on a certain religion, they're kind of closing themselves off, and they're not benefiting from the larger ecosystem that gives greater meaning and resonance to the humanness, to the possibility of being fully human. So it's that, to me, we're at this inflection point, which is diversity is, if this is pretentious or something to say, if I were God, I wouldn't want people to bow to me. I would want them to praise and take care of creation that I made happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't bow to me. Take care of that which was created and revel in that. And so if we are now in the era that we're in, multicultural, multidimensional, different, just gender, ways of looking at gender, race, ethnicity, it's fascinating. And what in the courses that we do, is that I welcome that, and I encourage people to bring themselves and their perspectives into the dialogue that we have with each other. And when we meditate with each other, you can feel the influences, like in the ecosystem, of these different perspectives, traveling, say, over the ethereal consciousness airwaves, and we are all then stimulated and grown and just deepened in this sense of diversity and honoring it and celebrating it. And gee whiz, it's a lot more healthy than thinking there's got to be one and my one is better than your one.
Mm-hmm.
So the process, what we're doing, aims to further that. And it is a process. So the 7 steps of the meditation are not a practice in the sense you all got to be doing the same thing here. You all got to believe in the same thing. But here's something we can do when we're all sitting down together from either no tradition or some Native American and some Sufism and some Buddhism and some Hinduism and some Islam and some Christianity and whatever. And we can just honor and celebrate the presence together of all the diverse views. And in our dialogue, we're going to expose each other to it. But in our meditation, it's almost like we're all sitting around a still pond. We're each dropping a pebble from our place around the pond. And then we're watching how the ripples of that pebble, of our respective pebbles, reach out and then begin to cross with each other, but keep going, right? Mm-hmm. So that we are transmitting that at a deeper level, the ripples in the pond that we all sit around and we all share. So the 7 steps are meant to try to enhance that aesthetic that way.
If you're enjoying the episode, please consider subscribing to our Patreon to help support the production of the podcast.
Subscriptions begin at $1. All patrons receive access to bonus content, curated resources, and exclusive patron events, including live Q&As.
For more information, please check out the Patreon link in the show notes, and thanks for listening.
And so what are those 7 cues in the process that people contemplate together, except they're having an internal experience, but on the vibrational level, they're dropping those pebbles in the pond. But you have 7 cues for the process. Take us through them, these broadly human things.
Well, and they're kind of practical, really. As I said earlier, I grew up in Iowa. We're kind of practical, kind of. So it's like, so yes, I'm mystical, I'm intellectual, I'm devotional. All these different factors are part of me, but also what can be actionable? What can we really use here? So to me, the first thing for anything that we set ourselves out to do, which is challenging in any way, is our motivation. Right? You got to have strong motivation to finish a PhD or to become a nurse or a doctor or become an athlete or whatever it happens to be. You got to have strong motivation. And it turns out that meditation is one of the hardest things that most people ever try to do, right? Just sitting in silence a little bit, that is really hard. And then people have this sense that, if you're going to be a meditator, you got to be able to sit on a cushion in a dark room for endless hours. And they say, I'll never do that, right? So, depending in our whole system, depending on your learning style, your spiritual style, we help you find a meditation that you can do. It's part of it. But you still need motivation. Wake up in the morning and to remind yourself of why it's important to do that to set the tone of the day. You got to write that down. And you can listen to a motivational speaker. But that only lasts for so long. You still got to have it for yourself. So, and one of the easiest things to you would think to say in terms of our motivation is health and happiness. And so that first step is called motivation. May I be happy and healthy, right? Well, then in a curriculum and in a dialogue, you say, well, what do you mean by health and happiness? Is that something internal? Is that something you get from the outside? What is health? And so it becomes a question too. So everybody's got to kind of answer that for themselves. And they're going to be at different levels, different ways of looking at it. But nevertheless, we're all doing the same kind of thing there. And then the second step is we all have experienced it. We wake up in the morning and all we can see is darkness, problems, stress. Oh, how am I going to get through this? What we lack is a remembrance of our gratitude, the things for which we can be grateful. So we can shift it if we're intentional about it and say, let me just take a little time to remember all the things for which I have to be grateful. And at each step, we journal these things, so we remember them. And the gratitude could be for easy things. Got a house over my head. I got food to eat. I got a community. I have a partner. Or I've had great teachers, a great blessing. I'm grateful to nature for providing my foundation for my existence. I'm great. And so you begin to shift your mentality at the beginning, and that will carry you along for the day and in the next steps. And the third is, may I be transformed. So now it's just to say, may I have the audacity to think of my grandest potential as a human being. So transformation on a daily basis, yeah. Can I be more patient? Can I be more loving? Can I be more effective? But may I be the being that I really have always aspired to become, that I've admired in the people that I hold out to be, the people that I really admire. May I become like that, and may this meditation that I'm doing help me to do that. And then we do our, may I be loving and compassionate. And so oftentimes in spiritual traditions, they say you got to start with that. That intention is everything, which is true. But starting with love and compassion is like, really? How many times of the day am I actually loving and compassionate? Let me just do a second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour, and say, how much of that time was I really loving and compassionate? And just have a little humility and say, okay, may I really be that loving and compassionate being that I would like to become? Think about it. Use a meditation, a metta meditation. Say the 1 Corinthians out loud, whatever it is, St. Francis of Assisi or Rumi. Have something to help you then move into that state of love and compassion. And that would be part of your practice for step 4, love and compassion. And then may I become mindful. So mindfulness is part of it, but mindfulness is then the result of the first 4. So we're preparing our mindfulness meditation, because in causality, that which goes in determines that what comes out. So if our meditation on mindfulness is just, may I increase more money in my life, may I get rid of whatever, then the effect might be that, but you're losing the grandest opportunity of mindfulness and the reason for which it was taught, which is to help you be loving and compassionate, to help, end the suffering of other beings. And then that has a much grander resonance in your own well-being, step number one, in being truly happy and healthy. And then the sixth is wisdom. May I become wise through this meditation. May I achieve the wisdom where I can do the most good for the most people, or however you state it in your own words. And then you meditate, allow that wisdom to well up from within you after you've quieted your mind. You've created the first 4 or 5 steps of the meditation. You could bring in the wisdom that you've gotten from your tradition. If you're a Hindu, it might be that my Atman be one non-dual relationship with Brahman. Whatever it happens to be, you've prepared the wisdom. You've prepared that possibility for that wisdom to arise. And then you move into the last step is, may I be in service. So before we get off the cushion or we stop our walk or our swim or however we're doing this, we then look at the day ahead of us and say, how can I bring this meditation into my day? How can it help me serve others? How's the rubber going to meet the road here? And so then that night you might review it again and say, how'd I do? Oh, yeah, I blew up with that person. I was impatient. Okay, great. I got something to work on here. And so it becomes an interactive meditation process, honoring diversity, helping us to live into the day as better people, more helpful people, come back and see it as an interdependent process that we just do. It becomes a natural part, autonomic to our way of being. It just becomes a natural thing.
And so for each person, may I be transformed, may I be grateful. There's a unique expression of that for each individual. Not everybody wants to be transformed into the same thing or has the same vision of what that might be. Their gratitudes are different, etc. Their motivations are nuanced. And so in that way, it allows for that diversity. Not everybody can see this, but I can see, over your shoulder, onto your shelves, and I see what looks to be maybe a picture of Milarepa. I see some traditional Buddhist text wrapped as they are up on the top shelf there. And anybody with the experience of these things could see in your process something that has reference in Buddhist Tantra. So a certain kind of structuring of practice that is clearly tantric from that broader way of describing Tantra. Do you ever explore this with people? Or has anybody else noticed this?
Well, not that much. I mean, it's informing me from the inside out. Oh, and I got to say, for the listeners or for your podcast folks, that I wouldn't be doing this if it weren't for your help. That panel, because Zalman introduced us back in 2002, and we worked really closely, and then you became the editor of the books and publisher. So thank you. So this is a dialogue that's been going on for 20 years.
Yes.
Yeah. But the Tantra to me was the hardest for me because I got used to using my rational, my intellect, my ethics, epistemology, and logic, and all that, and a practice. But Tantra was a mystery. I was a little uncomfortable, even though I'd done some initiations in Tantra. And so a project that I have now is to complete a film that I shot in 1981 on the Kala Chakra Tantra, with interviews with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and others, the first time that it was done in America in a big way in 1981 at Geshe Sopa's temple called Deer Park. So, as I said earlier, it's interesting. You look at the Dalai Lama and Geshe Sopa, these are really smart people. They're intellectually really smart. So you have these incredible comments. Thomas Keating, but at the same time you see Thomas Keating in an intellectual discussion, and then you watch him doing Eucharist, right? When he's doing Eucharist, it's a kind of Christian Tantra.
Yeah.
Right? It's a transformative thing, and everything stands for something, and you are becoming, in my words, not everybody will do it this way, but you're becoming Christ. Now that's audacious. Now, within Buddhism, the ideal is to become Buddha, right? But if you say that in a Christian context, my ideal is to become Jesus, you could probably be, that may not be looked at, that would be really very egotistical and presumptuous of you. And maybe you need to leave our church right now because we don't look at it that way. But from a mystical perspective, it would be to say, let Christ consciousness inhabit you, or however you would, whatever. So that's a tantra. And it's imagining yourself as the result, right? And using your imagination to imagine what it would to, and this is a long discussion, but we are imaginal beings. Our eyes provide the visual stimuli, which are maybe the most important way in which we bring in knowledge, and our ears and our hands that do mudras, and our voice and our ears that do the chants, and our eyes which visualize. So the fact that you would visualize, just like in a Christian tradition, you would visualize Mother Mary, but in that visualization, you would be saying, may I accumulate the qualities of Mother Mary. And I use my visual consciousness to have something to look at that will strengthen that inner. So Tantra works, on that level of creating deities that embody the qualities that we wish to achieve. But then it goes further in dealing with the inner, what's going on with nadis and chakras and the use of the internal energies and winds, which is beyond my capacity to explain, in this kind of a format. But I find it fascinating now. Mm-hmm. And now that I'm doing the film on the Kala Chakra, it's a great opportunity for me to go deeper in something that I've always been, I'm not sure about that. And now it's fun to really inhabit it and let it inhabit me and add to the mix. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so we've been talking about interspiritual meditation and the 7-step process. So thank you for sharing that with us, Ed. I'm struck by the process, and it leads to a question for me, which is, religious or spiritual traditions have a wide swath of practices, rituals, community aspects. Kind of what you're describing with the interspiritual meditation seems to be one practice. But earlier you were talking about an interspiritual path and how people who are in this space of interspirituality by default are oftentimes left to create their own religion. And what does that look like in terms of, through your Spiritual Paths Institute, but just more broadly, how do you envision that for people to actually actualize a spiritual path that is interspiritual in its fullness?
I think that's $1 million question, whatever now. And I don't have the answer.
I'll take my $1 million right now. Thank you, Ed.
Yeah, you got it. Personally, I don't see interspiritual. I like the term interspiritual as an adjective. But when you put the ity at the end, it begins to sound like, what are they trying to create a new religion here? What's that all about? So I think that is a process that we're experiencing. And the answer is, personally, the answer is not known. I don't aspire to create a new religion. I don't aspire to create a kind of formation into which everybody lockstep understands things in the same way. So I think it's a wonderful, it's a wonderful question. But, when I look at the 7 steps, it's a process, but not a practice. So normally when we think of practice, these different traditions have a practice which are meant to get you to the destination that they prescribe. Right? So one of the dangers we have is appropriating practices that were devised to do one thing, but getting them, putting them over in our own little bucket list of things of the 7 steps. So as we do it, we need to be humble and be really about what our intention is. And if you're going to take, say, a metta compassion practice, from Buddhism, you can slot that into number 4, may I be loving and compassionate. Because the way in which, say, Pema Chodron and others talk about metta, it really is not specific to Buddhism. It is so you can find that. You could find, or you can find a quote from Rumi, which doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a Muslim to look at love the way he looks at it, So what we're doing is helping people to find practices within each one of the steps of the process that can define their path. So we're not all on the same path. We don't all have the same answers. We all don't have the same content for each of the 7 steps. What we have is a process that we can do together, with mutual love and respect. And and celebration. So, different people doing interspiritual work now have different views about that, how that's going to be. And for some, it could be creating a new sect, with its own formation, very specifically outlined. For me, it's more of an open process right now. And with the answer to your question is still out there, and I just kind of pray silently that it doesn't end up like what happened to the other traditions, the institutionalization and the structure and the hierarchy, that it can develop and avoid those human tendencies that befall most great ideas,
Yeah.
How can I make money on this thing anyhow, and how can I become rich and famous? How can I become, it's like, just use it as a process.
Yeah.
And create and do the research in our courses, people are asked to do the research, and we provide prompts. We provide a custom database that has been curated to help people find resources that they can examine for each of these steps and say, oh, okay, I didn't realize that Rumi did that. I didn't realize that St. Francis, I didn't realize. So then you begin to learn about it, and then you begin to either incorporate them into the step or make your own step based on their influence. And that becomes your practice within that part of the process.
So I appreciate that you're not trying to create your own new religion, and that it maybe is problematic to even think about creating a new religion. But each of us, as we navigate, or those of us who feel identified as interspiritual, are in some ways inevitably forced to create a new religion, in the sense that we are choosing what we believe, what we want to commit to in terms of practices or disciplines. And so I just wanted to zero in on that as a particular challenge, whether somebody was engaged with the Spiritual Paths Institute or was just engaged in the kind of interspiritual world we live in. There is that dynamic, and it feels like a tension, because how can we have the integrity, the knowledge, etc., to really create a religion anew or for ourselves?
Right. Well, let me just say, when I started the project, I had the audacity to say, do-it-yourself religion. and I didn't really think of the consequences of saying that. I just thought, you're not finding anywhere else. Here's hopefully a kind of process to help you create your own. So then really, as part of our process, you have to take the time to define, what do you mean by religion? So if I say I'm going to create a religion, well, what does that entail? Is it a system of ethics? Is it a system of metaphysics? Is it a system of, defined goals like soteriology? Is it a system of practice, of rituals?
Exactly.
Which a lot of religions encompass. So that's what, religion connotes, all those kind of things.
Exactly.
So I would say, but in the sense that you're trying to create your own meaning system, your own meaning and purpose and practice, that you, in a sort of like adjective, sort of or adverb, I think it would be, religiously practice, then you're using the term religion in a slightly different way. But this is kind of my dedication. This is what I do. And in that sense, it's kind of my religion. But it's not my religion as opposed to your religion or somebody else's. So I would say it's safer to say my spiritual path, which is here's my individual journey and how I define it. I'm using the 7. And then the book that Metta and I held up earlier, this Mandala process, is a way to help me define what my spiritual path is. Yeah.
I'm a lot less picky about whether I say interspiritual or interspirituality, because, at this point, I don't care about what the criticisms are. But I agree with you. I'm not trying to create a religion. And we've always agreed that we've been wary of those that are trying to create a religion out of interspirituality or the interspiritual. Where I tend to stand is, it's just a fact. It is a fact of how things are, that traditions are hyphenating in people's individual personal experiences, that our religions are bumping up against one another, and trading electrons in that process. New chemical bonds are forming. And more, there are people that just don't identify on one side or another, but between, in liminal spaces. And those are interspiritual spaces. And for me, it just names a fact of our experience today. And I don't even feel like I need to defend interspirituality because it's as easy as pointing at something. And part of the beauty of the word, as you mentioned early on, and giving credit to Brother Wayne Teasdale, is that it gave a name to something. And names can be overused, but when we're in the kind of time that we're in now, with many young people declaring that they do not identify with current religions or they feel excluded from them, when you use the word interspiritual, there's a big yes in them, a naming that, I do have a place. It is between and beyond. And that feels very validating and liberating for them. So just, looking at that word, it's done something for us, and it's been powerful. But when I was thinking about Daniel's question to you about, those people are left in the position of, in some sense, creating a personal religion. And then you do have the book, Mandala, Creating an Authentic Spiritual Path. But definitions then become, and specificity become really important. Yes, you're not prescribing a spiritual path. But I think it goes back to your founding and co-founding, rather, of the Aspen Community School and the emphasis on learning styles. So maybe tell a little bit what the book Mandala is actually doing.
Oh.
It's not prescribing a spiritual path or even how to create one exactly, but what is it offering?
You used in that title of the book, there's the word authentic.
Mm-hmm.
That term is a problem because it does imply that it is authentic in the sense that others are not. But if we stretched out that subtitle and say a spiritual path that is authentic to you, to me, that it's safe.
Yeah.
It's okay. So, respected resources. Okay, who's to determine that? Authentic resources. All these terms that we try to use. And anyway, this gets us into some really interesting questions about how we personally authenticate a source, this source, as opposed to another source. What are our research skills? What methodology are we using to be able to select and say, this is something that's going to be useful to me and this one is not? So the spiritual path that we're trying to articulate in the Mandala book is determined. What we're trying to offer is a kind of another process for helping one in a more disciplined, systematic way, pull together the answers for them that define their spirituality. What happens when I die? What's the reason for suffering in the world? Goodness is just, all the major questions that we address in the book. And there are 12 of them. And then how are we going to determine our personal answers to these questions that are going to define my path and the way I do my practice by honoring my own spiritual styles? If I'm really more devotional, let me work with that. If I'm more artistic, let me work with that. If I'm more intellectual, let me work with that. If I'm more kinesthetic, use the body, let me work with that. So it's meant to help people to find the resources that help them define their path. And as they do the process, they use our search engine, they use our journaling, they use the way of practice circles of communicating with each other and sharing ideas back and forth. They use our weekly classes that we do. People can do this process, either on their own as part of a group, or they can do it on their own time, in their own time. But both the ISM, Interspiritual Meditation, and the Mandala practice are really meant to be lifelong works. So when we offer our courses, it's like an introduction. Let's get started here. And then if you want to go deeper, you can become a facilitator in that or become a mentor in that to help other people. So what we're trying to do is just help people find their way, help people find their path, and provide methods and a process for doing that.
I think the value of the Spiritual Paths Mandala or the Mandala book is that it helps people discern. So you might call it a discernment tool, the mandala. Here are 12 spiritual styles. Is your way the way of the artist? Is your way the way of prayer? Is your way the way of the mystic or the devotee? And they can feel into that process, and then you give them tools for exploring each one of those that feel right. Well, the way of prayer in Judaism looks like this, or the way of the devotee within Buddhism looks like this. And then there are also another set of 12 questions that they can explore around, is my primary question around consciousness? Is it really about death and mourning? Is it about the nature of reality or spirit beings? And then you give them ways to explore and discern. So I think it's a valuable book for these things. And I don't just say that just because I was the editor. The discernment is a major issue for people today, and we aid them. We need to give them resources for discerning what is authentic for them, as you put it.
Mm-hmm. So the book is meant to provide a kind of foundation for that, but the work really benefits if we do it together.
Yeah.
So therefore we do our online classes. And it's kind of growing slowly, but it's like having the help of the creation of a community within which we are free and we are encouraged and we listen compassionately to each other, then it really helps us in the development of our own personal path. And our own personal path may look a little different than the person sitting next to us, but we love that, and we honor that. And then we all form community around that, rather than everybody has to be lockstep in one way of looking at things. So that, to me, that's the fun part, and when we're in community doing it, it really is a joy.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if anybody wants to check out more, we'll put a link to the website, spiritualpaths.net, in the show description, and definitely encourage y'all to get those books if you're interested in going deeper, potentially sign up for a course through the spiritualpaths.net website. But just to close us out, because we know you have to go, Ed, it's been lovely to have you. I feel like we've just scratched the very top of the surface, so maybe we'll have a chance to have you back on. I know there's lots to discuss, but really appreciate you coming on. I'm wondering if you can close us out with a prayer or poem or song or anything.
So what I learned working, as deep as I was capable within Buddhism, is that every area of learning that you do has verses for it. In the ancient way of learning, not everybody had books, so they memorized a lot. And then that gave them an outline for what their practice was going to be throughout the rest of their life. You see it obviously in the Jewish tradition and Islamic tradition. So that memorization was really important. So when I finished writing the book, I thought, well, what would it be for interspiritual meditation? So this one thing came to me, which was a kind of like a little chant, and also poems that I wrote for each step. So the chant or the mantra goes like this. May we be happy and healthy. May we be grateful. May we be transformed, loving and compassionate, mindful through our breathing, wise through meditation. May we be in service to all.
Amen.
So if you have that little tune can just accompany you during the day. It can just be. And just as an example, may we be happy and healthy. In all the world I cannot find a source of peace outside my mind. Neither play nor drink nor sex nor food can cause a constant blissful mood. The things I see, touch, smell, taste, hear, cause both joy and pain, hope and fear. Meditation relieves my mind of stress, leading me to health and happiness. And I'll end with it right there. So for each of the steps, there's a little poem and there's a little song, just to help people embody, what's going on in each of these steps.
Thank you, Ed.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Ed. Shout out to friend of the show, Treefort of Golden Turtle Sound, for producing the intro and outro music and assisting with mixing and mastering. Be sure to check out his awesome music and hit up Golden Turtle Sound for any of your audio engineering needs.